that competition, that made it possible that things are different and people think different and companies act differently. Now the European Union was set up based on the understanding that global development is about sharing things. And Europe in the long term only can survive and be competitive if they have some weight putting into the balance against other markets, against other regions. And of course it has to be economic weight. So how can you do that? If you just rely on a small country, even though they might be very strong, like Germany, for example, being economically very strong, or other big countries in Europe, like France or Italy. Yet again, looking at globalization and the speed of globalization, you have to find alliances. Without alliances, you're just stuck there. You might still be quite good in a certain environment, but on a global scale, you lose out. So Europe, and especially, of course, the European Union, have done a lot with respect to forming those alliances, with respect to laying out a very good playground, with respect to making things easier, bringing things together, having a single currency, working along one big market, having single tariff system, having the Schengen Agreement, which makes movement of people within the European countries very simple and very easy. And this, of course, has a tremendous impact on setting up and realizing one big market. And this again is, of course, very good for Chinese enterprises. Because in the past, you might remember the past, going to, let's say you had, as a Chinese company, you looked at a country in Eastern Europe as your first market. Now, how did it work? You had no unification in Europe, so you didn't have one single system. So you just went there, you set up your operation, and then you were stuck in that environment. If you wanted to get to other European markets, well, it was very complicated. It was very difficult. You had different currencies. You wanted to export, and had the problem of, all the exchange rates. You had the exchange rate risk. Completely different tariff systems, which made it very, very complicated. So that very much prohibited and hindered Chinese companies to develop in Europe. More or less, you were stuck in one place, but you couldn't get further. But now, of course, having one more or less harmonious single environment in Europe, it makes it extremely interesting for also Chinese companies to get into the market, and getting into the market now does not bind you to get stuck in one place where your primary sales market might be. No, no, no. You decide where you want to go in Europe and you just move back and forth. You can enlarge your strategy. You can be, extremely active, because it doesn't matter if you're in this country that you want to develop in the other country, and vice versa, because it's unified. Now, foreign investors getting into Europe don't face that many difficulties. So the attractiveness of an investor with regards to the European market, of course, also has grown a lot and improved a lot based on the facts I've mentioned before. From an investor standpoint, again, you don't just look at one market, but you look at the possibility that provides the European Union with regards to free movement of your money, of your people, of your goods. And of course, with regards to a single strategic approach you can use for Europe. So compared to other regions, and we've been talking about those like other markets in America or Asia or somewhere else in the world, Europe has a very political stable environment. You know, we talked about the markets, of course that's very important. We talk about fiscal policy, of course that's very important. But what is extremely important is the very high level of political stability, especially when we look at Western Europe. I've been talking about that before, looking at the historical development. Europe had to develop towards a very high level of political stability. Europe's experience is very simple. Only if you have political stability, you can go a step further. You can talk about market development, you can talk about social stability, you can look at environmental protection and sustainable development, you can look at economic sustainability. So those factors, especially for Chinese companies, are also very, very important. If you don't have a political stable environment that protects you, that protects your investment, that protects your know-how, sooner or later you will face up the very big risks due to an ever-changing market. So the idea of a political stable environment in Europe is like this. Government should not influence economic development. It should be a gatekeeper. So the politics should be like a night watchman. You're not just showing up to make sure that everything is stable, everything is safe, showing up in case something goes wrong, but not showing up if everything is moving very fine. So political stability and political environment for foreign investors in Europe, and of course also for European investors in Europe, means that the government makes sure that those things that need to be there for stable development, economically or environmentally or from a social standpoint, are there, and that they are at the right place. That's it. So they need to set up a certain environment, a certain framework, which you can follow. And a certain framework and a certain environment that does not change all the time. If you keep on changing laws and if you keep on changing regulations, how can you manage? How can you have a long-term strategy? How can you have a long-term commitment? Just, you know, we've seen it before. It's about long-term commitment. You only can have that if you have political stability. Otherwise, it doesn't work. You have a profound market economy, which of course results from political stability, which of course results from a very stable framework that gives you the tools and the means to go along the road of market development. We have seen before that Europe, as it was in the past and as it is explained through its historical development, is set up of a variety of bigger and smaller nations. Some countries are big, some are small. And looking at each country individually from the outside, it might not appear to be that big a market. It might not appear to be that very much interesting. So in the past, again, before the European Union, of course, it's not everything is rosy. When we talk about the European Union, it's complicated somehow. It's difficult. It's still like, you know, a young kid just born. So it has to grow up. It takes time, of course. But again, what the European Union, or the main idea of the European Union has set up, is a huge consumer base. And again, if you look at the market now, you have about 450 million potential customers. You know, some are there, some are not there. It's like even in China, you don't have 1 billion customers for everything. You have maybe 200 million